Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today, Flying Magazine senior editor Rob Mark is back to talk with us about two recent weather-related accidents and about what pilots can do to avoid accidents such as these. And in the beginning of the conversation, Rob mentions an article he's just written for Flying Magazine about VFR into IMC accidents. Last week in episode 167, we talked about what you can do to help prevent fuel exhaustion and fuel starvation accidents. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And if you're new to the show, please click on the subscribe button in whatever app that you're listening to us in so that each new episode of Aviation News Talk will be downloaded to your phone as soon as it's released for free. And if you stick around to the end and you're finding value in this show, I'll tell you how you can help support our work with a one-time or monthly credit card donation via Patreon or PayPal. And now here's our conversation with Rob Mark. Joining us here today is Rob Mark, senior editor at Flying Magazine. He also publishes the Jetwine blog at jetwine.com. He's worked with both an air traffic controller and an airline and corporate pilot and CFI. And we've also had him numerous times on the show here, most recently in episode 161, where he and I talked about the fatal Kobe Bryant crash, which apparently involved VFR into IMC, a flight in Southern California. Rob, thanks so much for joining us today. Great to have you back.
Hey, thank you, Max. I appreciate you inviting me along. And today, of course, we're going to talk about just that, VFR into IMC. It's not a new reason at all that people are hurting themselves in airplanes. In fact, it's been around for quite a long time. I just finished, in fact, writing a story for Flying Magazine that will be out, I believe, next issue about VFR into IMC. And of course, we all know what happens. People fly into weather that they have no business being in. But big question is why? So maybe that's some of what we're going to talk about today.
Well, everything we're talking about today is certainly weather-related. And the unfortunate thing about VFR into IMC accidents is that 90% of them are fatal, which makes them the most lethal of any kind of an accident. So if you're going to have an accident, don't have a VFR into IMC accident. I did a study years ago where I looked at VFR into IMC accidents over a 10-year period, and I was wondering, do instrument pilots also have them? And the answer was yes, though they have them at a somewhat lower rate. And I think there were certainly times when I was not current as an instrument pilot, and so I would fly VFR. And you've just got to maintain those normal VFR visibility and cloud clearance minimums. Otherwise, even IFR pilots can find themselves going into IMC and having an accident.
Well, I think, too, that when we are training pilots, we'll often ask them, okay, give me the cloud clearances for VFR. Well, let's see, 500 below, 1,000 above, and 2,000 horizontally from. You got it, baby. But the question is, does a pilot really understand what that looks like when they're flying VFR? How do they tell when they're 500 feet below or 1,000 above or 2,000 feet horizontally from? Because most of us never really get up there in those kinds of conditions to say, okay, here's what those minimums look like. And unfortunately, I think that people fly into weather and then they say, oh my gosh. And the first thing they do is always look down. And looking down does nothing more than make the situation worse, because you're in the clouds. There is no down, there is no up, there's no left and right. Unless you're really current on instruments, you're going to lose control of the airplane. So the key is some good risk management to make sure that you don't fly when those conditions are possible, or that you give them a very, very wide berth, which, of course, we're going to find in this accident today. This pilot did not give the weather at all.
Yeah, I've had at least two times that I can remember in my 40 years of flying where I went from VFR into IMC. One case was at night, and boy, I was working absolutely as hard as I could to avoid the clouds. We were in a metro area. Things were reasonably well lit with surface lighting, and yet we still found ourselves in a cloud. There are times when it's just virtually impossible to see the cloud no matter what you do. Now, in our particular case, we were very close to the San Francisco Bay, so I knew that a slight turn to the right put me over the water, push forward a little bit, pop back out of the cloud. But yeah, pilots really need to kind of anticipate when this might happen and have a good strategy for how to avoid it. Now, a great strategy, especially for people with an autopilot, is just snap the autopilot on and then do a 180.
That's true. And of course, I don't think we're going to know in this particular accident yet whether the pilot used the autopilot or not. He certainly never used the chute in the Cirrus. So, again, we know where this was going. And I think that sometimes when we train students as well, that we're not clear with them about the fact that if you do this, you will not only hurt yourself, you can possibly kill yourself and anybody in the airplane along with you. I think we're going to see when we talk this afternoon that some of this is a training issue. Some of this is just really, really bad risk management, which is why I think FAA and everybody else is focusing so hard on risk management for pilots.
Yes. And I think to your point, often I see a lot of training for the private as being very directed at the ACS, and it's directed mostly at, hey, let's make sure you're doing these landings correctly, make sure you're doing these maneuvers correctly. And there's just not really enough time spent talking about some of the judgment issues. Hey, if you encounter this kind of situation where there's weather, this is what you should do. And even if those conversations come up, they're probably such a small percentage of the time that I'm not sure that they really stick with people. And this is something that either you do it well or you do it at your own peril. And at any time you're involved with something that could kill you, you really want to know everything there is to know about that.
Well, I think most people do that are very conscientious about this. Of course, we know that there are also people who are natural-born risk takers, and they love the thrill of taking a risk. And it doesn't really work very well in airplanes. But let's talk a little bit about the details of this accident. So this accident happened just a few months ago in early September in Chester, Arkansas. And it happened about 9 o'clock at night. And to your point earlier, staying away from the clouds is a whole lot harder at night because you can't see them coming. Not for most of the time. So this pilot was planning a trip to North Carolina from home base at Muskogee Davis Regional Airport in Muskogee, Oklahoma, to North Carolina, which would have been a couple hours, 3 hours, I imagine, at night. He was a low-time pilot. He only had a couple of hundred hours total time under his belt, which is not bad in and of itself, but I think we'll see that had an awful lot to do with some of the decisions that he made along the way. So the pilot obviously had a weather briefing and knew there was weather. And when we're talking weather, we don't mean just low clouds. We're talking thunderstorm activity. And whenever you talk about convective activity at night, it's a really, really good place to stay far away from. And so the pilot was obviously concerned because he called his flight instructor and he said, hey, you know what? What do you think? Now, the flight instructor, because we tend to think on the safety side of things, said, I don't think that's such a good idea to go tonight. Why don't you go tomorrow? And so then they hung up. Unfortunately, the pilot didn't listen to his instructor. He decided that he really wanted to get going now, and they fueled the airplane, took off, headed east-northeast bound towards that North Carolina destination, called ATC along the way, and they were climbing up through 8,500 feet, and controller identified them and said, by the way, you've got some weather straight ahead of you. And he suggested the pilot turn about 20 degrees to the right. So think about this. Now, this person has just been in contact with ATC a few minutes at night. He's a low-time pilot. And the controller says, gee, you've got thunderstorms ahead of you. Now, the one thing, of course, we know is that if you're clear of the clouds, you can usually see something that indicates the storms are there because of the lightning. And whenever you see lightning, don't go there. And after the controller suggested that initial right turn of about 20 degrees for the weather, the airplane flew a couple more miles, and then the pilot said he was going to reverse course and go back to their original destination, which was a good move. And when the controller looked at the target on radar, that's not what the pilot was doing. He was heading more northwesterly, and he questioned the pilot about it. And the pilot said the wind was a problem, and he was correcting his course, and he turned further left to get back on course. And the pilot kind of ended up on a westerly heading. But then the airplane started to descend and started turning to the right. And the controller told him, you appear to be losing altitude, and you seem to be turning southbound now. The controller tried to call him back a couple of times, and the pilot never responded, and the airplane crashed into a wooded area not far from where the last conversation with the controller was. And unfortunately, in this airplane, it was not just the pilot, and this is what makes these situations even sadder, is that he took 3 members of his family with him, and they all died in the crash as well. Again, just to reiterate, the pilot was, he had been trained on the Cirrus. He had bought it previously owned. He went through Cirrus's Embark program, which, to their credit, Cirrus says, hey, you're going to buy one of our airplanes. We really want to make sure that you have a good idea of how to handle this airplane. So he went through the training. And of course, for people that may not be familiar with the Cirrus, it has a parachute on it. So you might be saying, why didn't the person just pull the chute? And some of this data, of course, I should mention, came from NTSB. Some of it came from the Flight Safety Foundation. But they found that the airspeed had so wound up on this airplane, it was descending way too fast to use the chute effectively. And I think on an SR20, the chute pull was like 130 knots or something, Max. Am I right on that?
Yeah, 133, and there have been parachute deployments at speeds of up to 187 knots. There have been a couple of deployments above 200 knots in which the parachute failed. So yeah, if you get too fast, you're unable to use it.
And in this case, some of the radar paints indicated that this airplane at one point was up to 230 knots, I believe. So again, even if he blew the chute, which we're not sure about, it would have probably ripped it apart. It simply wasn't certified for that, which meant that if he had pulled it sooner, before he lost control of the airplane, he might have lived through this. He might have broken his airplane, but he wouldn't have broken everybody on board.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about both the airplane and the pilot. The airplane is one of the original Cirruses, so it was a 2001. So it's not nearly as well equipped as the vast majority of Cirruses that we're used to seeing in the fleet. This does not have the Avidyne PFD and MFD. It is originally equipped, had round gauge instruments. I mean, it's possible they may have added something to replace those, such as an Aspen display. It also didn't have the Avidyne MFD. It had what was known as the RNAV, ARNAV, which was kind of a moving map, but which had far, far, far fewer capabilities than you would find in a typical MFD in any of the newer Cirrus aircraft, which suggests to me that he may not have had great weather information available to him in the cockpit. So he might perhaps have had ADS-B in. No way of knowing that. For sure he had to have ADS-B out, since this was after the beginning of the mandate, unless he was planning to stay completely below 10,000 and away from Class Bravos and Class Charlies. He probably had ADS-B out. But we don't have any indication that he had any kind of weather available in the cockpit. So that's certainly one thing I think that worked against him. And also, he was a relatively low-time pilot. He had gotten his private in November of 2019. He bought the aircraft in January of 2020, and the accident happened in September. So only about 10 months from the time that he got his private to the time of the accident.
We talk about risk management when we're training pilots. And what it means is, don't just say, oh, I can do that. Think about the consequences of all of your decisions. If I go tonight, here's what I'm setting myself up for. Bad weather along the way that I know there are embedded thunderstorms in. My instructor said, I wouldn't do that. I don't think that's a good idea. Uh, and somehow the pilot saying, nah, I can do that. I can handle that. And that's really the thing we want to know most of all is what in the world convinced this young pilot, I mean, young in terms of experience. Well, he was actually young. He was only 31. Uh, was it his ego that said, "No, I can handle that"? Did somebody in the airplane say, "Well, you know what? We really need to be at Aunt Jane's first thing in the morning tomorrow. We really didn't plan for a delay tonight, so there's no way that we can go tonight." And that's how it happens sometimes. It's not usually relatives beating on a pilot saying, "Hey, I expect to go this moment." They kind of cajole you a little bit, and that's a really bad voice to listen to when you're in an airplane. You need to have the courage to say, "I'm sorry, it's not a good night to fly around thunderstorms. It's not safe. We'll be better off. We'll leave early in the morning tomorrow. The weather will be gone." So we want to know what caused this pilot to make that decision.
So I suspect that this is a person who just didn't realize what he was getting himself into. But I will say that I think that even if the passengers don't put pressure on pilots to, fly when they shouldn't, I think pilots themselves have self-induced pressure. And think about it. This man invested a lot of time, a lot of money to become a private pilot. It was a weekend. I think it was a Friday. Clearly, they had plans. If they waited till the next day, then they're not going to be able to do quite as much on that weekend trip as they had hoped to. I worry that pilots sometimes are afraid of disappointing their family and their passengers, that, gosh, I've got to somehow prove to them and show to them that this investment in time and money that I made is really worthwhile. And we're going to, gosh darn it, even if there is a little risk involved, let's just go ahead because, it'll probably work out. And I got to tell you, for me, the word probably is a red flag every time I fly. Anytime somebody says probably, I want to be thinking, well, wait a minute, what if it doesn't work out as we had hoped it would? Hope is not a great strategy when you're flying.
Well, and let's be honest too that we don't want to beat this pilot up too much, because here we are sitting with a fair amount of experience under our belts, both of us, and this pilot didn't have that. So while we're not trying to simply Monday morning quarterback this, I can remember times that I did really stupid things when I was young, and I luckily lived through them so that I didn't lose my life. But again, it can sneak up on you because you don't really know what you don't know, and until you fly into it, then you go, "Oh, this is not good." Well, are you able to get yourself out? And they talk about pilots. If you fly into weather, what do they tell you to do? Make a 180. Well, do you have the experience on instruments to be able to just make a 180 and not lose 1,000 feet of altitude along the way and add 50 knots to the airspeed indicator along the way? It's not as easy as it sounds. So I think we're doing, and let's be serious, for a private pilot, we only demand that they have 3 hours of instrument time to qualify to take the check ride. And personally, I'm sorry, it's not enough. It just isn't. And I think that the fact that we have these accidents and that almost all of them are fatal, is an indication that we're just not doing enough.
I totally agree. And I also think that 3 hours of night experience is not enough. I think that, unfortunately, when people get that little certificate after the check ride, they kind of go, wow, now I'm a pilot. Now I can do whatever I want, whenever I want. And I think many of them just look at it as, the freedom to do almost unchecked whatever they want. And it's probably a lot easier for a pilot to say, hey, in the daytime, I know how to avoid clouds. But I've seen so many accidents with private pilots who are perhaps have less than a year of experience, who have taken off at night and crashed in weather, in the mountains, things like that. I don't think people realize that 3 hours that you get with a flight instructor at night or the 3 hours under the hood is really just the bare minimum that you need, and that you can get yourself into a whole world of trouble that you can't handle once you get your license. If you are in pitch black kind of conditions, there are no lights on the ground, you don't have a horizon that you can see. And of course, if you end up in a cloud, and we don't know for sure that that's what happened here, but it's quite probable given the thunderstorms that were in his path, you can't see the horizon, and so you can't keep the airplane straight and level. So, yeah, I think the takeaway message is for pilots who they've had their private for a year or two, maybe they haven't done many really long trips. Weather changes when you go on long trips much more often than when you're flying for $50 hamburgers. You need to have a plan B, and you need to really stick to your personal minimums. If you've got a cloud in front of you, don't just go barreling through it. You got to make a 180.
And I think your mention of a plan. Let's face it. When you get your private pilot's license, as you said, people think, "Wow, I'm a pilot. I can do cool stuff now." You're right. Absolutely, you can do cool things. But would you drive along? I live in the Midwest. Would you drive off of an expressway onto an exit ramp at 80 miles an hour if you knew there was ice on the highway? Probably not. If you did, you might only do it once in your life. And if you were lucky enough to live through it, you'd say, I ain't going to do that again, because that is incredibly risky. But most people don't see, again, flying as quite that risky because they don't have enough experience to be trying that sort of thing. And again, I think it really comes back to us as instructors to say, okay, look, you've got your license. Yeah, I know everybody tells you it's a license to learn, but it doesn't mean it's a license to try stupid things. And whenever you're that little voice in the back of your head says something like, "Oh, I can do this," you ought to stop right there. Yeah, just don't do it, because there's something in your system that's saying, I don't know, I don't feel real comfortable about this. And it's almost as if you're having a little dialogue with another person next to you. But again, this poor pilot, he talked to his instructor. The instructor said, don't do this. He didn't listen to him.
And I don't think any pilot purposely does what they consider to be stupid. I think the problem is that they're not aware of how dangerous some of the things that they don't realize, are crazy can be. You don't know what you don't know. And I think, unfortunately, pilots just don't have enough experience when they've got, maybe 70 hours and they've got that brand new private ticket in their pocket. They don't realize that they may be embarking on risky things. And certainly they should still be looking for guidance from experienced pilots, from flight instructors. They really should be, as much as they can, follow that guidance, because we're doing our best to help other pilots. And what can I say? Flying is fun, and it's a lot more fun not to be up in the clouds being scared to death.
Well, and I'll leave you one last thought on this for people that think that they can handle it. I've been an instrument instructor for a long time, since back in the old days. But I was out on a ride with my daughter and her boyfriend last spring, and we took off just to go see the downtown Chicagoland area, 172, and it was going to be really fun. And we were headed downtown, and I looked and I said, "Oh, and I see this gray area over here off to the right. Those are snow showers, and you can look down and you can see that the snow is hitting the ground." And so we kind of turned away from that, and we were going to go out by the lake. And I said, you know what? I'm not so sure about this, because those snow showers were not forecast. And almost as I'm saying this, I look out the window and I go, oh man, I'm in the snow. I can't see. I could see down, but I could not see anything left, right, or forward. And I said, all right, I know what I got to do. I got to turn around. And just the way it caught me so completely off guard, it was daytime. First thing I did, my eyeballs went right to the attitude indicator. And I said, okay, man, let's make this turn. Let's get the heck out of here. We don't want to lose any altitude. But I knew enough to do that. But if that had happened to somebody else, I don't know if they would have been fast enough to say, oh my gosh, I just got myself in a problem here and I've got to do something to get out of it. And it demands that I listen, not listen. It demands that I watch these flight instruments and realize what they are telling me to try to keep me alive.
Reminds me of a flight that I took when I was a relatively young private pilot back east. Flew from New Jersey to Massachusetts because I thought, hey, new state, let's add a new state to my logbook. And visibility was great when I departed, and it must have been gradually decreasing throughout the flight. And there came a point when I just suddenly it struck me, wow, visibility is one heck of a lot worse than it was when I took off. Now, it was still VFR, but it had changed so gradually, I didn't notice it. And I think that's what kind of taught me that humans are not good at noticing really gradual change. And sometimes the weather changes very, very gradually. And so you really need to be actively thinking and looking and considering and estimating visibilities and verifying that things have not changed.
Yeah, and one last thing I think too is that everybody I've taught, I take them out in weather when it is 1003. I want them to experience what that minimum VFR is like. And I remember the last time I did this, I haven't trained anybody in a while, but maybe a year ago. And the guy really wanted to go do touch and goes. And I said, hey, let's go. It was windy. It was low clouds. And we flew into a cloud. And I went, can't see the ground anymore. And he just kind of looked at me and said, well, what do we do? I said, pull the power back, just hold the wings level. And then we were out of it. And he said, I didn't know that could happen. I said, that's why we're up here, because I wanted to show you that it can happen. I didn't expect you to fly into the clouds, but once you did, that's the point. You've got to know what to do if I'm not alongside of you. And he said, I had no idea that it felt like that. And maybe you remember it too. The first time you flew IFR actual and you're flying along and all of a sudden, and you're in the clouds, you go, whoa. I mean, I did it. I had an instructor with me, but I went, wow, this is really cool. But it's so different from what I expected. Because I had no experience. But it can catch you very quickly. So anyway, should we move on to the next one, do you think?
Absolutely. And one thought I'll add is, and that first time going into the clouds can be very disorienting. I think people's attention is drawn outside, which doesn't do any good. So yeah, you want to get that experience in the clouds, hopefully while you're doing your instrument training with an instructor. But yes, let's talk about this next weather-related accident.
This happened actually not that long ago, October 26th of this year. So 3 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, it happened in the daylight. And a pilot was flying a Cessna 210 that he owned. And he was in Lubbock, Texas. And unfortunately, the pilot lost control of the airplane. And I know people are going to say, I know, this is another one of those VFR into IMC accidents. Well, actually, this one wasn't, because this pilot had an instrument rating, and he was actually flying on an IFR flight plan. And I think it's a perfect time to say, look, if you're going to fly a sophisticated airplane like a 210, a Cirrus, a Bonanza, anything like that these days has a glass cockpit and a host of really cool navigational toys, you're really wasting your time and money by not having an instrument rating, because you really can't use it all. And it's not just being able to use it, but you don't really know how to interpret what you're seeing. And so you're really losing the benefit of all that cool equipment. But however, this pilot was on an IFR flight plan, but because the weather got bad, he decided to divert to Lubbock. And when the controller set the pilot up for the first approach, the pilot reported that he was setting up for the GPS approach to runway 35 left at Lubbock. During the approach, the pilot said he wasn't sure of the instrument approach to expect and was not in a position to intercept. And basically he said, I lost situational awareness. And the controller obviously caught on to that and said, you know what, I'll set you up to intercept from a different angle. And that's when the pilot said, oh, I'm in freezing rain. And for people that have not seen freezing rain, imagine you're flying your VFR airplane in a rain shower and you watch those little droplets of water streaming up across the top of the windshield, and you can hear the rain pitter-pattering on the windshield and the wings. And well, now imagine that you're flying and that rain no longer streams up the windshield. It just seems to stop when it hits. Well, guess what? That's ice. That means that stuff is not streaming because it's freezing to the airplane. And unfortunately, what will happen is you add so much weight and so much drag to the airplane that even if you shove the throttle all the way in, the airplane may say, hey, guys, I can't do it. I can't fly. I don't have enough power. And that's kind of what happened to this pilot as he continued inbound on this approach. Air traffic said they noticed that his ground speed gradually decreased from 80 knots to 50 knots, and eventually down to 48 knots. The airplane suddenly made a turn, a left turn, descended, and the pilot then said, "Oh, he was having an autopilot issue." Unfortunately, the airplane continued to descend. And data stopped. And of course, we all know that the airplane crashed. But it was some FAA inspectors that got to the scene not long after the accident. And what was really apparent to them were the chunks of ice laying on the ground near the airplane that were in the shape of the leading edge of the wing. And this was not just a little bit of rime ice, which is kind of the rough shaped ice. This was a fair amount of ice. In fact, there's a picture that you and I have both been looking at. I'd say this airplane must have had at least 2 inches of ice on it, on the leading edge of the wings. And again, realize that when you enter ice, you become a test pilot because you have completely changed the aerodynamics of that wing to something that's very, very different from what the Cessna test pilots prove the airplane will do. So again, we're back to the same question that we were using in the last accident analysis. Why did this pilot fly into these conditions?
Notes here say that the ice ranged from 1 to 2 inches thick. And that just gives me chills when I think about that. I mean, literally, it just, as we're sitting here talking about it, it just scares the daylights out of me thinking about having that much ice on an airplane. Now, the Cessna 210 is an incredibly capable aircraft. This looks like it was a non-turbo version, but still, regardless, the older ones, I believe, had a 285 horsepower engine. Unless this was a really, really old one, they were somewhat smaller. Comparable to the engine size of a Cirrus SR20. And yet you can definitely, if you get into severe icing, you can load up an aircraft with so much ice that it will not be able to continue to fly. Now, I don't know what the weather was forecast to be in this particular situation, but often when there is icing, there is an air mat for icing. And so perhaps the pilot had some warning of the possible icing. Freezing rain is absolute worst kind of icing that you can run into. And the situations I think where you generally run into these would be under warm fronts. So you've got warmer air, which is above colder air. So it's raining at a higher altitude, and then it drops down into colder temperatures where your aircraft is located. And there is nothing that will add ice faster to an airplane than freezing rain. If you're in it, you've just got to get out of it immediately. It sounds like he may have had really severe icing. If you look at the FAA definitions, the worst kind of icing, they say, will accrete more than 1/4 of an inch in less than 5 minutes. And yeah, in those kinds of conditions, you've got to do whatever you can to get out of it. In this particular case, I kind of wonder, would changing altitude have helped? Clearly, with this first instrument approach, he might not have had time to get properly set up because he was diverting. And whenever you're diverting, you're kind of behind the game to begin with, especially if the airport you're diverting to is close by. One has to wonder if, had he been able to successfully fly the first instrument approach, if he perhaps wouldn't have gotten on the ground in time. So here we have a pilot instrument-rated, capable airplane, and yet somehow he got himself into a situation that exceeded the capabilities of the airplane and or the pilot.
Well, and as you mentioned, the pilot was diverting from his initial destination here into Lubbock, where the weather was about 700 overcast and 5 miles, but the wind was out of the south and it was very gusty. So it most likely was the kind of situation weather-wise that you mentioned. Could the pilot have climbed out of it? Possibly. I mean, that would be the first thing I would normally try, turning around and climbing, because you might as well try to climb, because eventually when the airplane says, I've had enough, you know it's going to come down. But the point is that you have to do something right now. Icing is nothing to fool around with in a light airplane. This airplane was not equipped for flight into known icing, but even those aircraft that are, which a lot of the Cirruses are, it doesn't mean, oh, I can fly all day long in the ice and I don't have to worry about it anymore. No. That's not what it means. What it means is it's giving you time to escape. As soon as you see the water freezing, you have got to get out of there. You climb, you turn around, you descend, you do something, because you don't have a lot of time when you start, gathering up ice before the airplane says, I'm done. And then you are out of control. And, well, we know where that ended up. And in this case, the pilot, did not have an airplane that had a parachute on it, but he either did not realize how fast the ice was accumulating, and it was daylight. So, and from the 210 cockpit, you can easily see the leading edge of the wings. So did it happen so quickly that he couldn't think of a way out? Clearly, early on when he was talking to air traffic, he was confused about what he was doing on the approach. Was that because he lost situational awareness, or was that from him constantly looking out the left window going, oh my God, I'm getting ice. I've got to do something. Let me see. What should I do? I'm supposed to be vectored for approach. Let's see. What approach were they going to give me? And it can pile on you very, very quickly. And so it's also important that if you're in a spot, tell ATC what's going on. They can't fly the airplane for you, but they can often help and say, look, 10 miles north of you, it's VFR, head that way. Or they can give you some advice based on what they know. A good controller will, at least. Unfortunately, it looks like this pilot waited too long to try to take some action, and the airplane took action on its own.
The common thing I see immediately between this accident and the earlier one that we discussed was it appears, at least from our limited information, that both of these accidents could have been avoided by a timely 180. And yet, I think that, again, things kind of creep up on us gradually sometimes. He was an IFR pilot. He was certainly allowed to be in the clouds. Maybe the ice started forming very, very, very slowly. He looked out and said, this is not so bad. I can handle it. And at some point when he got into freezing rain, clearly it started to accrete much more quickly. I worry that pilots often are so goal-oriented that they don't think about 180s as being, viable options. And certainly in a situation like this, if you had proceeded for some time and yes, you're picking up only very light ice, it might be very tempting to think, well, I'm close to my diversion airport. I'll just keep going there. And yet the moment he started realizing that he was getting freezing rain, that would have been the moment that I would have thought about doing a 180 and come up with a new alternate plan. Why divert to an airport that's going to keep you in freezing rain even longer? Anytime you're in freezing rain, there's an imperative. That imperative is to get out of that rain now. Nothing else really matters. So I would say that anytime anybody encounters anything that approaches severe icing or freezing rain, make that 180 now. Don't just continue on and hope that things are going to get better. As I mentioned before, hope is just a lousy strategy.
It is indeed, and again, we've all been there, thinking, okay, I hope this gets better, but realize that what we're trying to tell people when we talk about managing their risks, it's not just to decide, should I fly today or should I do it tomorrow? You must be constantly evaluating your situation en route, right up to the moment that you touch down. And I think your point is well taken that there could have been additional pressure on this pilot saying, "Geez, I'm only 18 miles from my destination. I mean, it's not that bad. I can handle this. And besides, if I land over there, then how am I going to get from that airport over to where the family is? And then I've got to figure out how to get the airplane there. Oh, all the wrong things to be asking. How about let's see, do I want to die? But unfortunately, people don't think like that. And again, while we're not trying to scare people about flying, because flying's great. You and I wouldn't have been doing it as long as we have if we didn't enjoy it. But if you're not constantly evaluating the risks that you're involved in, and I mean every second, right up till the you turn off the runway, you're going to hurt yourself someday. And I think again that's where we as instructors need more emphasis with pilots.
I think you may raise really excellent points. For example, we often try to instill in students that, hey, you need to constantly be looking for a place where you could put the aircraft down if the engine fails. And probably people are more used to thinking about those kinds of things than thinking about, these rare things which are very dramatic and dangerous, such as VFR into IMC and severe icing. And yet, you need to have thought about these things ahead of time from the safety of the ground. Because if you're trying to figure out what to do when you're up in the air, these kinds of seat-of-the-pants decisions are not going to be as good as the decisions you make when you're sitting there on the ground thinking about it. And if you really think about it, and I hope you do, you could probably come up with 50 different problems that you might encounter in the air. You really ought to have thought through before you left the ground sometime when you've got some time to think about this in your easy chair and reflect on it, about what you're going to do in each one of those situations. And as Rob said there, just constantly evaluate. For example, I was out teaching this morning a student pilot, and we were doing landings. You can darn well bet that as we approached on each landing, in my mind, it's a possible go-around. We might not actually be landing. So I'm constantly thinking of alternatives every time I'm flying. And for these really severe things that bubble up to the top, boy, you almost have to be primed with a hair trigger to react. You go into that cloud, make a U-turn. You start picking up icing that's severe, make that U-turn. You just can't afford to wait.
And that's true. And as I said earlier, we're not trying to scare people, but we are trying to make them aware of the fact that learn the lessons of the pilots that have come before you. Don't end up as a statistic. And people always say, oh, I've read that accident report. I mean, I would never do something like that. Oh, really? I'll bet you most of the pilots that we've been reading about in some of these accident reports today probably said the same thing. But when push came to shove and they needed to make a decision, they didn't make the right one.
Yeah, there are all kinds of reasons, I think, why pilots might not make the right decision. You might be a little hypoxic because you've been up 10, 12,000 feet for a while and you're just not thinking straight. You might be goal-oriented. Boy, I just absolutely have to be there today or I will be late for this appointment. I think it's so easy for even the best pilots, even those who are listening right now thinking, oh, I would never do something like that. Yes, you probably would given the right set of circumstances. So you really need to commit yourself ahead of time to what safety-oriented actions you'll take every time you run into these things.
And I think that's true. And, before we ring off, I mean, how could you right now, if you're listening to this, how could you guarantee yourself or the passengers that are flying with you that you wouldn't do some of the things that we talked about today? I mean, other than saying, oh, I'd never do it. I mean, think about that. If you were under that pressure, is there somebody you've flown with in the family or a friend that has tried to nudge you to do something that you really didn't feel comfortable doing? Did you ever do it to yourself, saying, I've got enough gas to make it to that destination? I know the needles look like they're it's almost empty, but I know this airplane and I'm fine. Have you ever spoken to yourself? Have you talked yourself into some dangerous situations that turned out okay, luckily? And how do you stop doing that from this point on?
Yeah, and I always encourage people to build extra margin into every aspect of flying that they do. So, for example, with the gee, I have enough gas scenario, do you have enough gas if it turns out when you get to your destination that the runway is closed because somebody did a gear up 15 minutes before you got there, or any other reasons? And are there other airports close by to which you can divert? So, yeah, I think people always need to build in lots of extra margin, which is why we tell people to land on the center line of the runway all the time. You know, if you're not used to landing on the center and you're off to the side and you get that gust of wind, guess what? You may be off the runway. So, yeah, build lots and lots and lots of excess margin so that if something does go wrong, you're still safe.
Well, this has been really an interesting afternoon talking about this. And tell me, do people ever write into you or call in and tell you that about some of the experiences they've had after they hear things like this?
Absolutely. Get all kinds of great letters from folks, and I'm sure we'll have a few stories of people who survived something that could have ended up badly.
Yeah. And again, realize too that we've all done it. We've all just been lucky enough to get past it. And it is sometimes just that, just plain old luck.
Yep.
And nothing more. You just don't want to trust your life or the life of your family or your friends to crossing your fingers and saying, I can probably make this work. Not a good idea.
Definitely not. So, Rob, if people want to find out more about you and follow your work, where do they find you?
Well, they'll find me at anything that has Jetwine in the name on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and those sorts of things. And, of course, at jetwine.com, the site itself, or, of course, in various stories for Flying Magazine.
Yes, indeed. Hey, thanks so much for joining us here today. Can't wait to have you back on the show again soon.
That's good. And aren't you happy I didn't make any bad jokes today?
We'll make that a totally different episode.
Yeah. Thanks, Max.
And my thanks to Rob Mark. Rob is a real asset to general aviation, and of course he's a great guy to boot, so I encourage you to follow his work. I've included links in the show notes to his Jetwine blog and to Flying Magazine where he works, and we'll have him back here again someday soon. And hey, did you know that we lose about a half a dozen Patreon supporters each month because their credit cards expire, but they never update them? And that's why we're constantly looking for new supporters like you to please step in and support the show, just so that we stay even, much less to grow our support. And when you donate, I will read your name on the show. And how cool is that to know that your name is going to be heard by thousands of listeners in over 140 countries around the world? And yes, we have listeners in places like Thailand, Mongolia, and the Czech Republic. Depending upon what level you sign up at, you may receive the scripts to our news shows, links to the many news shows we had to cut for time, and early access to some shows. For example, Patreon supporters at the $20 a month and up level received this show 2 days earlier than everyone else. If you'd like to receive all of those goodies, then you'll need to sign up through Patreon to make a monthly donation. To do that, please go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/Patreon and enter your credit card information. You can also support the show through PayPal, and their system gives you a choice of either donating monthly or making a one-time lump sum donation. Now, if you sign up via PayPal, I don't have a way to get the show notes to you, but you can still get the free online courses and books that I offer at the $35 and $50 a month levels. And to donate via PayPal, go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And thank you so much for your support. And finally, please tell all of your friends about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they still haven't figured out what a podcast is, and a lot of people haven't, just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, the same place where they download all of their normal apps for their phone, and you'll find our dedicated Aviation News Talk app for free. Just search in the store for Aviation News Talk. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.